Hello, and welcome to Expected Value, the podcast that goes inside the sports analytics world. I'm Paul Carr from True Media. This is episode 69, so it's the Jared Allen episode, perhaps, in honor of the defensive end who wore 69 with the Chiefs and Vikings, among other teams. It's also the Midnight Cowboy episode because the film Midnight Cowboy won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1969. I bring that up because we're going to do something a little bit different on this episode, something that's specific to the Academy Awards, which are given annually to the year's top films, just in case you didn't know. But this is also applicable to anyone who's building databases or thinking through data problems, a couple of key skill sets for anyone looking to work in the sports analytics space or any analytics space. On this show, we're talking with Ben Zauzmer. He's the Assistant General Manager of Baseball Analytics for the New York Mets. And we're primarily talking to him about his side gig, which is as an Oscars prognosticator. He has a book called Oscarmetrics, which you can buy on Amazon or wherever books are sold. He runs the Twitter account at Ben's Oscar Math, where he sends out award projections and trivia, a central follow for nerdy movie buffs like myself. And as he'll explain, these projections are not what he thinks should happen or wants to happen. Ben uses data, historical awards data, and a few other things to predict the Oscars. No one was really doing this until Ben started over 10 years ago. So his Oscar story is interesting, I think, not just for movie buffs, but for anyone working with data. And since those are two of my favorite things, he's a perfect guest to chat with right before the Oscars on March 10th. Ben and I will talk about how he got into the Oscars from a statistical standpoint, creating a database and projection model from scratch, all the different variables he takes as he puts his work together, projecting nominees versus projecting winners, the impact of betting markets, explaining probability to people, what kind of reaction he's got from the film community. He majored in applied math at Harvard. We'll ask what that means, and other majors and courses and skills he recommends to anyone looking to enter the analytics space. And of course, his favorite movie and Best Picture winners just for fun. Then producer Blake Arney will join me to react and wrap things up. One note that we did record this a few weeks ago before many of the pre-Oscar awards were handed out. So if you want the latest projections and info, check out Ben's Twitter feed. Without further ado, here's the Expected Value conversation with the author of Oscarmetrics, Ben Zauzmer. We're joined now on Expected Value by Ben Zauzmer, author of Oscarmetrics, and at Ben's Oscar Math on Twitter. Ben, welcome to the show. Let's start in movie terms with your origin story. How did you get into the Oscars and then later the prediction side of things?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Really glad to be on the podcast and great to be here. This all started for me freshman year of college. I was always a numbers guy, always a big Oscars fan, big movie fan. And I just wanted to know who was going to win that year's Oscars. So this was the 2011 Oscars heading into the 2012 awards season. And I just went to the internet and tried to find someone who had statistical predictions in all 24 categories. And I couldn't find it. And so I just decided to give it a shot myself. I spent about a month in the library and gathered every data point I could. Sometimes you could find actual data sets. More often than not, you're going through old PDFs of press releases to find one individual number at a time and eventually put together a very bare bones data set, bare bones model, and even more bare bones website to throw the results up. And it got some traction. It got some buzz. People were into it. It seemed like a fun thing that it turned out it wasn't just me that wanted to see these mathematical predictions for the Oscars. They did well the first year. This was the year that The Artist won Best Picture. So we're getting now 13 years ago. And it was such a fun project that I just thought, okay, well, let's try it again next year and so forth. And here we are now over a decade later, and I still have this as my fun winter hobby.
So you mentioned you're pulling stuff from different sources. Where do you start from a database creation standpoint, like both as far as, what sorts of things you're cataloging and also, how are you doing it from more of a technical standpoint?
So it turns out that I've collected lots of different types of data sets over the years to try and figure out what's predictive, and you sort of throw the kitchen sink at it and see what sticks. It turns out, and this probably isn't too much of a surprise to anyone who follows the Oscars, but by and large, by far the most predictive thing are these precursor awards. You've got each of the guilds, for the most part, hands out awards, and you've got other award granting organizations like the Golden Globes and the BAFTAs. You've got critic circles in each city. There are other things out there, from critic scores to box office numbers, that to betting markets that people put various amounts of stock in. Even, Twitter buzz. I've seen people try to predict this stuff using the number of times a
Yeah.
film star, the film name is tweeted. Uh, those can all be valuable in different contexts. They don't quite rise to the level of these precursor awards, which effectively serve as really flawed, inaccurate polls. And
Hmm.
polls, it turns out, are still better than most other things that we have in order to make predictions in this kind of a space, because each poll represents some subset or some cousin of what the Academy is trying to do when it comes to the Oscars. In terms of the actual mechanics, it's no different than any other predictive model where you're looking at the historical data and trying to figure out the relationship historically between all of these predictors and the thing you're trying to predict. In this case, the Oscar for best cinematography or the Oscar for best supporting actress, whatever category it may be. The predictors that in the past have done a better job are going to be given more weight. And so then you can plug in this year's data and you can say, oh, well, this film has done well with these predictors, but not as much with these predictors. And the computer can spit out percentages in each category and say, well, this nominee is most likely to win that category, but this nominee has a better shot over here.
And so each category, you're weighting things differently based on historical predictiveness, for lack of a better term.
Yes, for two reasons. One is just the straightforward fact that the same data doesn't exist everywhere. So, the Directors Guild, for instance, is an enormously important predictor of not just Best Director, but also Best Picture. They also don't hand out an award for screenplay. And so there's going to be limitations of that nature. The other reason is that even for the things that might exist simultaneously in multiple categories, it turns out, historically speaking, they don't all do an equally good job of making predictions in each category.
Interesting. And then what do you do with something like the BAFTAs, which have different criteria, or the Globes that have, two Best Picture winners? How do you work those into your model and such?
There really is no perfect predictor. And by perfect, I don't just mean that they line up with the Oscars every year, which of course would be the dream for me. There have been some runs. The Visual Effects Society had a remarkable run where they got the visual effects Oscar for a number of years in a row, and the BAFTAs did as well. But nothing's perfect. Uh, there also are no perfect predictors because there are none that precisely line up with the Academy.
Hmm.
Some are really obvious in that sense. The Writers Guild, for instance, every single year, without fail, the Writers Guild is going to make some scripts ineligible that are otherwise strong Oscar contenders because they have more restrictive standards. It has to be a member of the guild who wrote the film, which is not a requirement for the Academy. Don't even get me started on this year. Unfortunately, due to the writer's strike, the Writers Guild Awards are not taking place until after the Oscars.
Oh
So,
yeah, that's
needless
right.
to say, that's not great for the model.
Yeah.
But you know what? That's part of the fun of this. But even on a more subtle level, you can have awards that would seem to be honoring the exact same thing. Take, the BAFTA for Best Production Design, which is a solid predictor of the Oscar for Best Production Design. But you still have different voting bodies, and they can be looking for different things, and they might have different biases. There's a long-standing belief that the BAFTAs are biased towards British nominees
Hmm.
because they take place in England, and they might have connections with them and support them. And there are some years where you take a glance at the results and it appears to be true, and there are other years where it does not appear to be true. But I can't think of a single predictor that is 100% perfect and exactly aligned with what you're going for. And so,
Yeah.
what the hope is that the model over time can figure out just how much these flaws matter. That if these flaws matter a lot, they're going to deviate more in their results from the Oscars, and that predictor will get less weight. And if the flaws don't matter quite as much, then that predictor will line up with the Oscars and get more weight.
Beyond the precursor awards, you run through all sorts of variables in your book to see how they line up: age and billing order and number of nominations. How do you factor all those other different variables into your predictions?
So it's the same concept as the precursors, where I don't set out with any kind of preconceived notion of. I mean, I have my own instincts from being an Oscar fan and a movie fan,
Right.
but that doesn't affect how anything goes into the model. And so you sort of take a kitchen sink approach where you try everything and you let the data tell you which things are predictive. And the answer is not the same in every category. There are some times where the total number of nominations really matters, and there are other times where maybe it's not so much the total that matters, but having nominations in specific other key categories might matter. So, for instance, like having more nominations doesn't necessarily affect one's chances in the acting categories, but having a nomination for best production design actually is correlated with winning best costume design,
Mm,
presumably because people like the look of that film.
right.
Uh, there's some that are obvious. Best director nominations historically have been a solid precursor on the way to getting a best picture win, though that relationship has kind of been fraying a little bit in recent years. Some are less obvious. Best film editing is also an important nomination on the way to winning best picture, which, to more uh, astute viewers of the Oscars, that might be obvious, but to more casual viewers, it might not be so clear that as the nominations announcement is coming out a few months before, you should really be paying attention to best film editing if you care about who's going to win that top award. And over time, the data will tell us these things. Now, would it be easier to model if instead of 96 Academy Awards, there'd been 96 million Academy Awards?
Yep.
Absolutely. But you work with the data you have.
Right. So you mentioned some things that are kind of conventional wisdom that are borne out. Was as you do all the research and continue to do it, anything that flies in the face of something that is kind of just a cliche that people throw out around Oscar time, and you kind of want to raise your hand and be like, no, not so much.
I think every single year there is an outcry from folks who are frustrated that a very popular film did not do as well at the Oscars as they were hoping, whether in terms of the nominations or in terms of the wins.
Mm,
This year is a little different. This year, it seems the primary outcry is related to Barbie, and that's not just due to its popularity. It's also due to the issues of around gender and Greta Gerwig and Margot Robbie not getting nominated.
right.
But definitely part of the argument is that this was an extraordinarily popular film that really meant a lot to the industry as a whole. It got people back into theaters, which is a wonderful thing. And it got 8 nominations, which is fantastic, but not as many nominations as many of its backers were hoping for. The Academy, to put it not in data terms, but in English terms, the Academy does not care as much as we think they might, and as much as some people might hope that they do, and perhaps they will one day. But uh, there used to be a pretty strong correlation between what the audiences liked and what the Oscars liked, and that correlation has disappeared over the last 20 years. Not just frayed a little, it has disappeared.
Mm,
And so that is something that certainly will cause frustration for the fans of films year after year after year, where it was very popular. A lot of the audiences liked it. Even a lot of the critics liked it. The Dark Knight is a famous example that
right.
actually led to them
Well, they
doubling the
expanded it.
size of the Best Picture category. And yet still, uh, when these types of popular films do get nominated, they're often relegated to second tier status within the Best Picture rankings. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I am saying that it often flies in the face of what people are anticipating when they see a
Mm,
well-regarded, well-reviewed, very popular film that just comes up short with the Academy.
yeah. You also will project the nominees, not just the winners before the ceremony. What's different in how you approach that? Because obviously you have fewer data points with few awards having been handed out and such. What's different in those two different groups of projections?
Yes, there is less data, and it's also trying to model something subtly but slightly different. It is
Hmm.
trying to model the actual probability they get nominated. And so, roughly, that does mean that the percentages that I put out for that can be thought of as very early standings of who's actually going to win, but not exactly. Sometimes there are already very clear signs that film A might be ahead of film B to actually win an award, but film B has done more than enough to just get nominated, and they're both going to come out close to 100%. So a great example of that this year was Killers of the Flower Moon versus Oppenheimer for Best Picture, where if you plug in all of the inputs that I use for just getting nominated, they're both basically 100% or within a rounding error of 100%. That doesn't mean that they are tied. That's an important distinction here. And maybe I'm
Mm-hmm.
jumping the gun a little bit because of when we're recording this, but Oppenheimer is very clearly the front runner at this
Yeah.
moment. Now, that became even more clear when the nominations were announced. But even before the nominations were announced, there was enough in the data to tell us it was the early front runner. Not so solid that things couldn't change between now and then. We've seen movies make a wild run post nominations. Argo was a great example of that, where it did not get some key nominations, including Best Director, and then cleaned up in some of the later awards and won Best Picture. But this is not the time to bet against Oppenheimer
Right.
right now, proverbially speaking. And so mostly the model for picking the nominees is similar. This year it did very well. It got all 10 Best Picture nominees, or at least the 10 favorites got the nominations, depending on how you think about modeling. But it is sometimes subtly different because it's not trying to predict winners.
Yeah. So we mentioned we're early. We're recording this a few weeks before the Oscars. Oppenheimer is the clear front runner in your opinion right now?
Yeah, with every other top Best Picture contender, or frankly, any Best Picture contender, you can find flaws in its Oscar resume, so to speak.
Right.
And so, you think about Barbie missing out on the Best Director nomination, as did The Holdovers, or you think about Best Film Editing, like we were talking about earlier, uh, also not giving nominations to those two. You think about Killers of the Flower Moon being the only one of the 10 Best Picture nominees not to get a screenplay nomination. Even the mere fact that Oppenheimer got 13 nominations, having the most nominations in and of itself is not always the most predictive thing of Best Picture. It's a bit too simplistic of a view, but it's not entirely wrong. There is some truth to it. There's just a little more nuance in, which categories did they get their nominations in. But it's pretty hard to look at any other contender this year and say, yep, they've checked all the boxes to be a true Best Picture frontrunner. Oppenheimer is really the only one where it's hard to find the obvious flaw in its Oscar resume to this point.
So you mentioned, you publish the percentages. As you know, anyone who publishes projections, percentages for whatever, politics, sports, award shows, you're going to get some flack when your model is quote wrong or doesn't predict the correct winner ultimately. How do you explain the probability of the percentages to people?
Yeah, this is inevitable. I mean, there's two categories of this. One is just Twitter is Twitter, and
Right,
you can
right.
get all
There's
sorts
bad
of
faith for sure.
awful, vile, whatever. And I'm not saying that's representative of the majority of people on
Yeah.
Twitter, but it's just par for the course on that site that from time to time you get some really awful stuff, and that's to be expected. But putting that aside, there's also the more common one, which is perfectly friendly, and they don't mean anything wrong by it. But right, is exactly what you're talking about, where it's the disappointment of, well, maybe for the nominees, you predicted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 had the highest odds, but actually it was 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 on the standings that got in. And so the one that had the fourth highest odds missed out, and the one that had the sixth highest odds got in. Or when you talk about winners, maybe the nominee with the second highest chance won instead of the highest chance. I don't think of that inherently as a win or a loss for the model, though I realize a lot of readers do. What I
Right.
think of it is the model is trying to assess the probability that an event happens. And if the model is well calibrated, something with a 60% chance, which is going to be the front runner in a category with 5 nominees,
Mm-hmm.
heck, even if it had 2 nominees, 60% would be ahead of the 40% competitor. Um, that is still 60%. And if the model is well calibrated, 40% of the time, the model should be quote unquote wrong. In
Right.
fact, if the 60% nominee won every single time, that's actually more of an
Yeah, that's true.
indictment of the model than it might seem.
Mm-hmm.
I realize that that's a subtle argument and maybe a tough sell with people that are looking to this as a pure crystal ball of what is definitely, definitively going to happen. And I respect that. And I knew when I started publishing these that that is an area of criticism that you can get from publishing predictions before something inherently difficult to predict happens. It's part of the fun. I think the other category I get is definitely some frustration at the idea of you can't use numbers to assess the quality of art. The funny thing with that criticism is actually I agree with it 100%. When my model says that such and such is the front runner for, best actor, which, this year it looks like it's, either Paul Giamatti or maybe Cillian Murphy is probably going to wind up as the front runner, but we'll see as the award season progresses. That is in no way in my mind saying that Paul Giamatti or Cillian Murphy was the best actor on the year.
Right.
To me, it is trying to model how a group of voters will behave, probabilistically speaking. And whether or not the voters got it right, I will leave that to future generations of film critics who look back at these movies 50 years from now to ultimately assess the rightness or wrongness. There's a lot of famous examples in Academy history, Citizen Kane lost Best Picture and things like that, where I think we all generally agree they don't always get it right, and that's okay. The goal of the model is not to get it right. The goal of the model is to guess how voters will vote, and sometimes it'll be right, and sometimes it'll be wrong.
Yep. I mean, losing is sometimes a feather in the cap for some of these movies that they get more popularity or whatever because they lost, and that's a big deal.
Yeah,
So we know what the slow road of analytics has been in baseball, football, any sport really, as far as kind of analytics versus the eye test or scouts or whatever dichotomy you want to draw there. I'm curious from the film community, what kind of reaction have you gotten? Because I mean, you touched on it a little bit, but you're bringing numbers to a unquantifiable art in some ways. What sort of reaction have you gotten from that side of things?
I feel like it's been mostly very positive. I know in the last answer we talked about some of the more common criticisms, but those are honestly few and far between. I think that for the vast majority of people, they take this for what it is, which is almost itself a form of entertainment. Now, it's a form of entertainment that builds on another form of entertainment, which is movies and the Oscars, but it's not meant to, I don't put it out as a betting tool. I never bet on the Oscars or anything like that. I don't put it out as a definitive prediction of what's definitely going to happen. I put it out for fun. Like I put it out as a series of articles and tweets and trivia facts that people who enjoy this stuff are welcome to read, and people who would rather not have their Oscars tainted with the horror of numbers are welcome to not read. And uh, I think that the vast majority of people are reading it because they find as much fun in this very niche, unique intersection of things as I do.
Yeah.
And so I think by and large, the reception has been very positive.
You mentioned betting markets a couple times. Obviously, that's growing in popularity and accessibility in the U.S. How has that affected what you do? I mean, from are you factoring it in at all to just how you use that for comparisons, or how does that factor into your
I
predictions?
do I do use it. I started using it a few years back, and it's been useful. Not as the end all be all predictor, but it is one input. And I think the main thing that it picks up that the precursors sometimes can't
Hmm.
is any kind of narrative, especially late breaking narratives out there that can sway voters that happens a little later in the process or for some other reason is not going to affect voters in other awards bodies. So
Right.
an example of
Yeah.
the first one might be, let's say that after voting is done for the precursors, but Oscar voting is still around. Let's say that one of this year's nominees goes and does an interview and says something terribly offensive. That's probably going to hurt their chances in a way that the precursor awards wouldn't know about because they already happened, or at least the votes were already sealed and locked in. The other example would be, let's say that you have a nominee that take Diane Warren this year for Best Song. This is her 15th nomination. She's never won at the Oscars. Now, I don't think she's going to win. I think it's pretty likely that Barbie grabs that category, whether it's for What Was I Made For or maybe I'm Just Ken. But one of these days, she's probably going to win her Oscar. And a lot of the precursor awards have already given her honors for various songs that she's written over the years. And so some of those voters might not feel as compelled towards her because they
Mm-hmm.
might feel like, well, she doesn't have any kind of she's owed for career achievement or anything like that. But an Oscar voter might feel that way if they really value her body of work over her career and feel that, she's now 0 for 15. Will it be 0 for 16 one day? And, at some point might feel like she has to get her Oscar. So you can have narratives that don't impact other award shows, but do impact the Oscars for one reason or another. I think betting markets sometimes can help pick those up. And I think that's why the model indicates they are, in fact, predictive. Now, you can go too far with that. I also
Right.
sometimes think betting markets are very focused on narratives that sometimes are more born out of Twitter and less born out of reality, or things that aren't really going to impact the Oscar voters, or maybe are things that are already being encapsulated by some of the precursor awards and other predictors, and you don't actually need to double count. And so there are probably times where the betting markets get a little too carried away. I get asked a lot, like the morning of the Oscars, like, oh, I just saw this nominee's odds just shot up or shot down. Does that mean that someone from the accounting firms is illegally placing bets and they actually know who's going to win? I've never seen that late breaking movement in the betting markets matter at all.
Mm,
I think
okay.
it's based on Twitter hunches and people go wild. I don't think there's anything
Yeah.
real
Yeah.
there. So sometimes they get carried away, but by and large, they are helpful.
Yeah, it reminds me of like NFL draft betting, which goes crazy the week before, and Will Levis is a top 3 pick or whatever it was because
Exactly.
someone's cousin said something, and not so much.
Exactly.
It would also be really funny if Diane Warren won for Flaming Hot and beat Barbie, and yeah, but that'd be a big
And
surprise.
that would definitely magnify the outrage that already
It'd be,
exists among.
oh, it'd be great slash terrible. Anecdotally, I feel like there are fewer surprises now, and I don't know if that's just because there's more data and closer to it. But have you, from your studies, have you noticed any change in the volatility of results recently? Are they more predictable now than they have been, or is it just they're all a little closer to the sun?
I would say slightly more predictable, only because as time has gone on, I've gotten slightly more data to work with, and not just me, but the population at large has. There's been a proliferation of It's not just me doing it with math, but also people doing it with more traditional methods of observation and talking to folks in Hollywood that are making predictions, which I think leads to just more intelligent conversations around who is likely to win Oscars. People used to show up at Oscar parties before all these precursor awards, before this awards prediction machine exists,
Yeah.
which I suppose I'm one tiny bit to blame for, and they would have no idea, and they just saw two or three of the nominees, and they take their best guess, and they send it in. They hope to win the popcorn bucket prize at the end of the night. Nowadays, I think most people show up at their Oscar parties who are into this stuff, who at least have some idea in the really obvious categories of, okay, Divine Joy Randolph, like, she's going to win. Like, if you're trying to win your Oscar pool, you're probably not picking somebody who's not her. And that does, I think, lead to a sense of less volatility. But, the moment I say that, this is going to be the year that every upset happens. And so it's not like a perfectly linear trend towards perfect predictiveness. The model I built has come within one of, you can call it getting every category right, or you can just call it all but one of the favorites won that year. I would still be pretty surprised if in any specific year every single favorite won. I do think there's still too much noise, volatility, luck, whatever you want to call it, in this domain.
Yeah, I mean, if you're 90% on whatever 18 categories, you're probably going to miss one or two or three.
Right.
What do you do on Oscar night? How do you experience it? What's your process of enjoyment, tweeting, etc.?
So I used to, back when I was in college, I co-hosted an Oscar party and, had dozens and dozens of people come over, and we'd all watch together, and people be cheering on as the picks were coming right or not right. And that was always very fun. But as I got more and more into trying to be, the guy on Twitter for having the most outrageously specific and absurdly niche trivia facts, and, I put out dozens and dozens. I'll go into Oscar night with like 20 pages, single space of tweets ready to go, most of which I'll never use because I have to be ready for every combination of every set of winners. And it became too much to also try to be refilling the pizza and the cookies. And so my Oscar party hosting days are probably behind me, but my wonderfully supporting and loving wife and family are going to be joining me. And so it'll just be us and my laptop and the TV, and it'll be a nice quiet Oscar night.
It sounds pretty good. You mentioned some of the other random, notes, tweets. This is more of kind of a database structure or process standpoint, but you're doing things like certain words in the title of Best Picture nominations or different combos of nominations for films. How are you doing that research?
So the hardest part definitely was the data gathering. There really is no perfect database out there. I'm pretty convinced if there was a perfect database out there, that everything I do, whether it's the trivia or the predictions, someone else would have got to long before I got to it. The Oscars themselves do have a database of just the Academy Awards that they put out on their website. And even that, it's not in a perfect format, and there are still errors that I find in it from time to time. So I've meticulously gone through, this has been a years-long project. Probably the biggest part of this whole thing has been cleaning up the data. And it gets easier and easier every year. It's not something that you have to go back on every year. But especially in the first few years in college when I was doing this, that was a pretty substantial project. It was just going back through all this historical data and checking it for accuracy and cleanliness, and making sure that if the nominee is spelled this way here, it's spelled the same way there, because otherwise the database won't know that they're the same person or the same movie. And at this point, I feel pretty good I feel good enough to put out these tweets, and I am terrified of ever putting out a tweet that's inaccurate. And so it is pretty important to me that I've got the data as clean as possible. From there, it's pretty straightforward. I have enough of a coding background that if I've got the data, it's not too hard to pull out these fun facts. And then I just try to throw a little spice, a little creativity, try to think to myself with the possible nominees or the possible winners, like, what's the weirdest fact I can come up with the data I have, and try to be ready to go if it happens.
So there's a few general questions about getting into the analytics field. I guess if someone's constructing some sort of similar database, they have something they want to put together. And they don't even know where to start. They have never done this. What are the skills, software that you generally will point people to as this is how you get going in what's called the database construction / maintenance field?
Well, I hope for their sake that whatever field they're starting with maybe has a little bit better data than the Oscars. So this was nothing more than having Excel open and going through thousands and thousands of old press releases and everything else in one at a time, putting in ones and zeros. There's nothing fancier than that. For most projects out there, especially for somebody who's just getting started, I do think that the easier way to get started is often seeing if you can build from some pre-existing database. If it's in the sports world, you've got the baseball reference, pro football reference, basketball reference suite of websites or Fangraphs type websites that can get you started. And then maybe you need to supplement it with other things that you have. Beyond that, the one other skill that can be very, very useful in database construction, if it's something where the database does not already exist, is the ability to do some basic amount of web scraping, whether that's more traditional web scraping, just grabbing the metadata from the website, or something like Selenium, which is a library that actually allows you to act as a user going to a website and then pull the data that way. But that can save enormous amounts of time depending on what the nature is of the data you're trying to grab, assuming it's something that's available online. If it's something that is purely available in books and you're going to the library and you're there with a notepad, more power to you. I don't know if there are any shortcuts to that kind of data gathering, but sometimes, depending on the project, might be necessary.
You're an applied mathematics major at Harvard. What is that for those of us who weren't math majors? Like, what's the difference in applied math versus math, and how does that help with as you crunch these numbers and others?
So I love the applied math major. It was terrific. The real practical difference, because I still took some math courses just like the math majors did, the practical difference was more for me in the requirements, that it turned out that the applied math major at Harvard had a much broader array of requirements, where instead of just taking 12 to 14 math classes, they were willing to work with you to come up with a plan where it was, okay, I'm going to take 5 math courses and then a couple econ courses and then a physics course, a couple computer science courses, a few statistics courses, and I even took some government courses that were more quantitative, and you mush it all together and they count it as a major, which I really loved. For me, that was the appeal of it. Was I wanted that variety. You call it liberal arts education or whatever you want to label you want to put on it, but that, I think, allowed me to graduate with a much more well-rounded view, not just of mathematical statistical methods, but how they can be applied in a wide variety of circumstances. And from there, it's almost like you have the grammar, and then you can go out into the world and it's time to start applying that grammar to the actual language of the Oscars or anything else.
I'm sure, you get asked this question like I do. I'm a student or someone looking to kind of shift into the analytics field. What other majors courses? There's lots of different options, but is there anything you kind of point people toward from an academic standpoint if they're looking to get into the analytics field?
So the wonderful thing about this type of work is that the information is actually very accessible. That between the amount of books out there, the amount of online courses out there, including very, very high quality free online courses, the information that's available even through something like Wikipedia, the information that certainly that you can find in a classroom. If I'm talking to somebody who is a current college student, I might be recommending specific courses in statistics or data science or related fields. But even someone who's already graduated and maybe a master's isn't for them, and so it's not going to be through the classroom per se. The amount of free, high quality resources out there to learn basic data science skills, stuff that did not exist, even as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, is a really wonderful thing. And it means that these courses are available to people who might not have the financial means or the time to be going back to do additional coursework. So there's a much lower barrier to entry at this point for getting some basic coding skills. Also, a lot of great free courses available and paid courses available to develop, whether it's in SQL or R or Python or Stata or whatever it is that is best suited to the field you're interested in working in. But it's been really nice to see this explosion out there from academic realms, from things you can pick up at Barnes and Noble, because I think it does really democratize this area in a way that it really wasn't 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was in college 20 years ago, and almost none of this was out there outside of hardcore computer science type of majors, programs, things like that. It's great that it's much easier to get to now. Okay, we wrap things up with our Playing Favorite segment, which is just going through a number of your favorites, get to know you a little. So what's your favorite number and why?
Favorite number and why? Oh, that's a
lucky number, whatever it might be.
Well, let's keep it with the theme of the podcast. I'll say for this year, we'll go 96. It's the
There you go.
96th Academy Awards coming up in a few weeks. How's
There you
that?
go. I like it. Favorite athlete, favorite player, at least as a kid.
So as a kid, I grew up in Philadelphia, and so definitely it was all the sports heroes of the late '90s, early 2000s. So you're talking Donovan McNabb, Allen Iverson, Jimmy Rollins, that whole crew.
Yep, I like it. I'll ask you the impossible question, but do you have a favorite movie, or at least what you say, what's your favorite movie when annoying people like me ask?
Oh, not only that, I've got a whole top 100 list on my laptop.
I'm with you.
That
Yeah, yeah.
shouldn't surprise anyone who knows me. But number
Yeah.
one, and this is not the most common choice, is Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Ah, I like it.
1939, black and white, Frank Capra, Jimmy Stewart. It's just, it's that's my I'd take it to a desert island kind of movie.
Nice. And that did not win Best Picture. Do you have a favorite Best Picture winner?
It did not, and it lost to Gone with the Wind, which is also, certainly it's
Not bad.
controversial in terms of
Right.
messages around, race in the South at that time. But as a piece of movie making, I think it's undeniably, extremely influential and impressive. So you can't fault the Academy's
Right.
voters in 1939 for not picking Mr. Smith. Not to mention Wizard of Oz was nominated.
That was
it was a
crazy
ridiculous year. Favorite Best Picture winner, I would probably say, and again, this is more for just being in sheer awe of the technical capabilities of, wow, how did they do that, was Titanic. So I don't know if that makes it a more or less cliche, but just one of those, like, every aspect of the filmmaking I was just so impressed by. But there's so many great choices out there. I'd include Casablanca and Sound of Music, and you could go on and on with that list.
Yep, for sure. And finally, you have a favorite "How did I get here" moment, Oscars wise? Like, meaning all this stuff you've done for the last decade has brought you to some presumably cool moments, places. Any particular thing that stands out there?
One I distinctly remember. So a lot of the writing I've done has been for the Hollywood Reporter, and they've been wonderful to me. They publish these articles as freelance articles every year, and I get to work with them, and it's a lot of fun. And when I used to live in LA, they would send me a couple times to do freelance assignments covering some of the more minor award show red carpets. And I was covering the Costume Designers Guild Awards one time, and was kind of in the back of the crowd, just sort of watching as everybody came in on the red carpet, and not really there to do much of anything other than put out some tweets, maybe write some words afterwards, and then kind of got accidentally shoved up to the front, and I'm there, and everyone's expecting me to start asking questions as if I'm an actual reporter, and I don't. That's not my area of journalism. I don't have that background, and suddenly I'm face to face with Mark Bridges, who won an Oscar for The Artist, and then was up that year, I think, for Phantom Thread, and ironically enough, a movie about costume design. And suddenly he's looking at me and he's ready for me to start asking questions. I have no idea. And so I pull out my iPhone and pull up the voice memos app, and I'm ready to do an interview for, a fictional article that I have no intention of writing, and just, start asking questions about, the movie and what made him design it. Fortunately, I'd seen the movie, thank goodness.
Right.
What inspired him to design this costume that way, and talk about his awards chances. And then, finally exhaled when he continued down the red carpet. And that was a real, how did I get here kind of moment.
Yeah, that's fun. Good story to end with. So Ben Zauzmer, author of Oscarmetrics, thanks for joining us here on Expected Value.
Thanks so much for having me.
Back in the True Media Studios, I'm Paul Carr. Thank you to Ben Zauzmer for joining us on the show. Follow him on Twitter at Ben's Oscar Math. Buy his book on Amazon. Check out his work at The Hollywood Reporter. All those links are in our show notes. Joined now by producer Blake Arney. Blake, welcome back. We had a different kind of show here. What did you take away from talking with Ben?
Yeah, definitely a little different for someone who isn't quite as big of a movie buff. I actually really did enjoy it because I learned a lot. This was something that, even coming from a background of like knowing a little bit, I wouldn't say I'd be an expert on building out data, building out analytics, and building out that kind of data, I guess. It was really interesting to hear how it just sparked from, this isn't really something that exists. I'm interested in it. Why not just give it a go? And I mean, look at where it's gone to now.
It reminded me so much, just from a process standpoint, when this had to have been, 2008, 2010, somewhere in that range. Josie Altidore scored for Hull City, I believe, in the Premier League. And he was very young. And I'm working at ESPN at the time. And I'm like, I wonder if he's the youngest American to score in the Premier League. Not something that was easy to find. Like the data literally just it wasn't out there. I mean, not that many Americans had scored, but, McBride had 36 goals or something. And, there were 100 maybe goals at that time. So what I ended up doing with the help of some other ESPN Stats and Info teammates is like, we literally had to track down every goal. Premier League did have box scores essentially on their site. So we found every goal by an American. You input all the data. Like it was a very manual process. I'm sure there was some scraping that if we'd known anything, we could have done a little more easily. But sometimes that's where you have to start. And it was helpful in the sense that you just really understand what's there and what's available. But data acquisition and cleaning, it's a big part of the process, I think. And it's changed so much now because there's just feeds for so much stuff, NFL games and baseball games. But a lot of times, like that's where it begins. And I think it just helps you mentally to kind of understand what you're trying to do and where you can go with it and what you can do with it. But sometimes that's what you have to do. You're scrape through old PDFs and put in data together. I'm sure you've done similar things if you're looking up, whatever result for this or who's the first person since that. It's kind of fun. It's kind of annoying, but it's just part of the process.
Absolutely. It's funny when you say that. I think back, working with Sporting KC, I think about when they have some shootouts that in the past, I was trying to scrape up some data about players and their history in shootouts. And I'm pulling up videos from, the early 2000s of guys taking shootouts in Croatia or some random shootout. And I'm able to find a video of it because, a lot of times I'll find it on a website and I'm like, I don't know if I can 100% trust this. And I'm going and finding the video somewhere. And it's honestly some of the most fun moments in working in this space is finding those moments or finding those specific pieces of data that you've been really searching for and then being able to confirm that it's true.
One thing we needed, like John Hark's jersey number from a goal he scored for Nottingham Forest in like 1995 or whatever. And it just wasn't anywhere. And, I just like emailed a few random Forest people and like a month later, somebody got back to me. It's like, oh yeah, it was number 4 or whatever it was. And I was just so happy at like being able to complete a data set, things like that. And we kind of joke about just the fun and challenge of it, but I do think the value in it is just in the ability to do these things and to show your process, not necessarily just like looking it up, but in the way you've developed something is pretty important to hiring people. I've had many, front office types tell me, we'll say it's a baseball team. Knowing baseball, you have to know baseball to some extent. But oftentimes they're looking for, how you go about things. Like, okay, show me a problem that you had that you're trying to solve with data and how you went through that process. And sometimes that's as important as some model that you have developed. It's really just showing them how you think, not what you think, but just how you think, how you attack processes. That's super important. And it's something that anyone trying to hire in this space is usually looking for and important to be able to show. So even if you think, hey, I don't have the baseball chops or background or models or my own algorithms to get a job in, say, baseball, but if you've done similar things in other sports or even not sports, if you can show how you take data and do something with it, that's just as valuable to people who are trying to hire you. All right. Thanks, Blake. Thanks once again to Ben Zauzmer for joining us on the show. We don't have any other Oscars episodes in the archives yet, but we do have 68 other shows with people from across the sports world, including our previous episode with Bobby Bandelow, the coordinator of advanced scouting for the world champion Texas Rangers. So while you're there, please subscribe, rate, review the show, share however you can. You can follow us on Twitter at True Media Sports to see how people around the sports world are using our websites to find great information too. For producer Blake Arney and everyone here at True Media, I'm Paul Carr. Thanks for listening to Expected Value, the podcast that goes inside the sports analytics world.